So happy to have you here for this wonderful talk on rethinking theater politics in contemporary France and Greece, perspectives by Dr. Ifigenia Gonis and Dr. Zafiris Nikitas. We are going to have two presentations. First, the politics of the S, rethinking the narrative of la décentralisation théâtrale. And the second presentation will be on minority theater, exploring the Greek paradigm by Dr. Zafiris Nikitas. So I'm really excited because we present the work of two Citizen Tales members, and we're gonna explore what is the theater politics in contemporary France and Greece. I expect a wonderful dialogue and discussion after this. Let me introduce first Ifigenia. Ifigenia Gonis, PhD, is a 2020 graduate of Harvard University's Romance, Languages and Literatures in the French department. Her dissertation, titled Dynamic Spatial Relation in Contemporary French Theater, examines the intersections of cultural politics, aesthetics, the spectator-spectacle relationship, and the history of theater decentralization through case studies of 4 Paris area public theaters. She is currently based in Paris, where she teaches English language and literature at the Lycée École Internationale Bilingue. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thought I'd begin just to give a little bit of an overview of what la décentralisation théâtrale, theater decentralization is. Just give a bit of a historical perspective. So what we call in France theater decentralization, speaks to a movement that has its origins in the late 19th and early 20th century, and specifically what was going on in theater at the time. So that time, the theater scene was largely, first of all, concentrated in Paris, which is the center, let's say. And theaters were run by people who did not necessarily have a background in the arts, but rather were more business oriented. So as a consequence, the offerings were largely seen as being very commercialized or very bourgeois. And there were critiques leveled against this from both, let's say, sides of the political spectrum. So more conservative critics were claiming that theater offerings were too debauche, or they lost sight of the larger moral purpose of the form. And while others, especially on the left, were pointing towards trends for commercialization, so for programming focused on what brings in money as an inhibitor to creativity and innovation in the form. And on both ends, there was also this question of the relative inaccessibility of theater at the time. So which we can understand this in the following context. So first, the economics. So theaters were, at the time, they were not subsidized, which means that they were very expensive. And it was, unaffordable for most of the popular classes. And there was also a question of who could get to the theater in the first place, because of course we have people on Provence who, even if there were some theater houses there, was not as present of a form of entertainment or of diversion, etc., which goes into, again, the question of geography. The theaters, because it's in Paris, if one lives outside the city, you have to have the financial means to reach the capital and buy a ticket. And there's the question of the greater territorial or social fabric that the theaters are located within, and whether it fits in with them, what relationship it has with them. And then, of course, social access. So if theaters are only accessible economically to a certain class, that means that for more classes to access the theaters, there is a question of, social presence. So theaters get a sense of exclusivity, that it's only for a certain class of folks who have a certain form of financial and cultural capital to be able to appreciate what is going on. And then which brings us to the question of who belongs in the theater house in the first place. So here already we have this idea of an imagined public, which becomes very central in the various movements that took place to try to bring theater outside of Paris. So there's always an idea behind of who it is that we are presenting to. So the decentralization movement arose from a desire to democratize the form, in part by addressing those above concerns of access. There were several efforts at decentralization that were put forward. I'm not going to get into all of them. because there was a lot during the early half of the 20th century, including most significantly during Vichy. And there is actually certain elements of theater decentralization in Vichy that are still present in let's say, in the current politics of theater decentralization. But it was not until after World War II that efforts to decentralize actually became directly integrated into state policy. And what I contend is that there was a need after the war to rebuild a sense and an image of national unity, because, you know, France was very divided during the war. So there was that, but there was also the fact that France was also in a period of decolonization, either by willingly, or in the case of Algeria, not. So at the same time, there was a sense of the country needed to have this sort of national identity behind it. And this kind of brings us to perhaps the most concrete element of theater decentralization project, which was the implantation or building of theaters and cultural houses throughout metropolitan France, even in cases where a region or a commune did not necessarily vote on having one there. This was done under France's first official minister of culture, his name was André Malraux, under the auspices of creating a sort of unified network. And I'll just add this as an aside that I do not believe that it is coincidental that this process of implanting and building has colonialist undertones, but this is something that I'm interested in exploring in a further project. So I'm kind of leaving that there. Perhaps if we want to discuss it later, we can. And Malraux, he was the first minister of culture, and one of his big projects was to create and maintain this network. And he does this primarily by creating a certain vision of what culture is. And I want to draw attention to a speech he gave during the inauguration of one of these cultural houses in Bourges on April 18th, 1964. And it's here that he kind of outlines what he believes is a very strong link between culture and French national identity, and going insofar as to anchor the relationship between the two within a context of nation building. So he says, to paraphrase, that 5 years prior, I'm translating a little bit, 5 years prior, 1959, under the creation of the Ministry of Culture, we said that France reprenait, takes up again, sa mission, its mission, dans l'ordre de l'esprit. So taking up again this mission of, let's say, touching on the national spirit of the people. So this is not really, the word mission here, it implies an act of a higher order, but not necessarily in a religious sense, but more in one whose politics lie in the pressing need to accomplish a desired goal, which in this case is an affirmation of identity. So pushing this point is the verb, the use of the verb reprendre, to take up again, with the re implying a beginning again of an action after a period of interruption. So again, we are at the point following, this is about 20 years after the end of the Second World War. We can see from a political standpoint the necessity in situating this present action of taking up again of a mission as part of a singular, going back to this imagination that there was at one point a singular French identity that existed before divisions manifested themselves. And as Malraux implies, this can exist once again, but the rebuilding of this unified France would have to involve the creation of a common project, one that would manage to contextualize France's Républicain ideology in such a way that its maintenance or even survival directly implicates the active participation to some degree of most of its citizens. So culture becomes, in Malraux's model, this link to achieving this particular form of socio-national reunification. So the decision, for one thing, to concretize a cultural politics via building of these theaters and maisons de la culture, it's an effort to reimagine the totality of France's territory that bolsters, again, this issue, the discourse of reunification. So as originally envisioned, what these culture houses would be, they would be dispersed around several cities and regions in France. So they would essentially become the physical manifestations of a singular state politics. So their presence would, in this case, be something like creating a thread, like a web, literally a spider's web, that would link several regions together, despite any disparities in terms of local cultural nuances and politics. So it's a politics of diffusion out from the center, but it does not necessarily mean that Paris has entirely lost its place as a locus for decision and policymaking. But what the construction of centers of cultural production does is creates, of course, it creates a direct line back to the center as a point of origin, but it also allows for the creation of sublinks from one center to another. So Bourg in this, it will link back to Paris, which is where, this is where the site for approval for funding and subsidies kind of has to happen, because this is how it works. But Bourg will link to Amiens, it will link to Grenoble, it will link to Montpellier. So you can also, go or circumvent the center, let's say, to keep these connections alive. So you're creating a sort of interurban model of connection. And these architectural implantation of cultural centers are reflective of, I would argue, the certain conceptualization of a theater as a form that not only creates a sense of unity between itself and the public, but more precisely homogenizes this public, which otherwise remains heterogeneous and disunified. So in order for us to accomplish this idea of cultural national unification, there is behind that a certain degree of an imagining of a public that is itself falls under the umbrella of a certain singular identity. What that does, however, is erases obviously any forms of divergence or potential for discord and conflict. However, the reality of the situation is that there's no such thing as a monoculture in France. There never has been. But of course, there was a particular vested interest in creating that impression at the time. And this kind of has lasted, I would say, especially around in the world of theater, up until very recently. And this is due, I would argue, in part to the resurgence of asking questions about identity, about directly challenging concepts of universalism as the French understand it. So this is particularly the element that for me gives me pause when I consider what is going on in French cultural politics. And this is where I kind of introduce this idea of establishing the S in publics. So if we have the establishment of this network under Malraux for the creation of un théâtre public. So the singular is very important there. So we have le théâtre public as an institute. I would argue instead it is perhaps more appropriate to talk about like les théâtres publics with an S at the end of it. Because even though there's these connections that the web exists, there is enough divergence in what I'm seeing happening on the French stages that perhaps I would argue it is time to move away from this unifying conception. So while, of course, this risks moving from this idea of a singular to this plurality, it does risk destabilizing the theoretical framework that has anchored the imagined role of the public theater in France for the past 50 plus years. I do not think destabilization is a bad thing. What I think it has allowed to emerge is a possibility for a new kind of cultural politics, which does not necessarily work to serve the aim of national unity, which has arguably underscored the ministry's project since their inception. So even as we move through after of the 1960s into the 70s and 80s, and we started integrating different forms of media and forms of art that would constitute as culture, the idea was still to bring them in under this larger national umbrella of this is still like La France. It's not, there is a way that there is a sort of central connection that kind of brings these things all together, if that makes sense. So this is what I would call the politics of the S, this idea of the plural, the difference, everything in between, everything that is ensconced within this idea of publics. So we can see this, for instance, and this is kind of a brief summary of what my research has been like. how we can look at this through an analysis of artistic direction and programming in relation to the spectator spectacle, spatial dynamics and relationships. So during my research, one thing I've noticed as I've frequented several theaters in the greater public theaters in the greater Paris area is that they all seem to have this status as a micro space wherein, modes and parameters of negotiation and interaction are put into practice. So they are places of accord. So we can say that they are places where we have this idea of union, of coming together, of commonalities. But at the same time, once you're inside, they are places where there are encounters, and when there are encounters, there are moments for discord and divergence. And this, I would argue, actually mirrors the larger territory that they are situated within, insofar as they represent this large body that is in itself very incoherent. When you go from the Maison de la Culture in Bourg and to the one in Grenoble, they are not going to have the same philosophical project and artistic direction. So to say that they should follow one is in itself kind of a contradiction. There's a tension in there. So I say that this incoherence mirrors itself the greater, publics that these theaters are there to serve. That there's a sort of this, what I think ties the theaters together is that there's an acknowledgement of a presence of difference among their patrons. That if we are going to be a theater that serves publics, the imagined publics that we see sitting in the house, there has to be this, there's almost a sense of that it is not impossible to fully imagine a perfect, let's say, public, but perhaps it may start, we may come the time to acknowledge perhaps that there are limitations to how this imagination works. So I would say it's a consideration of this difference is, I don't know, I almost consider it as a given. But it's difficult, I think, to categorize this acknowledgement of difference as a greater politics, because while there is shared, recognition of difference among these theaters, there's no shared status about how to respond or interact with this difference. So it's in this space, I think, of action and process that I find the political is situated in there, and it's manifested through artistic direction as well as possibilities for interaction and interpretation and negotiation that are created during the courses of performance. So this, again, it's this divergence in terms of precise definition of artistic or cultural politics that allows for public theaters to, as a whole, I would say, more closely approach the very publics they purport to exist in the service of. So with the idea of difference or plurality as a point of departure, there also follows the absence of this universalist imagination, which itself is a big counter to what French, let's say, sociocultural politics still tries to maintain. We are not trying to singularize these publics. Instead, what's happening is a move away from a mode of thinking that proposes a model of what a public should be. So it's moving away from this. So this right now is, we can see it as falling in with contemporary conversations over the question and definition of national identity that are very, let's say, yes, common in France in various sectors. So similar, we can say, perhaps echoing back to initial conversations and discourses that prompted the creation of a Ministry of Culture in the first place. But if, for instance, we consider this question of the imagination of the publics, one of the dangers that we could potentially fall into is reverting back to an exclusionary model of theater. And if that happens, if we start, let's say, using these, let's say, pluralities and things and trying to, even with that, reverting back to a process of trying to imagine what could be an umbrella that unifies these, that is not their, let's say, the fact that they are different, what I would say we risk doing is falling back into the very patterns of exclusion and of elitism that plagued the French stages even, before, and then I would say arguably up until still now under the original projects of theater decentralization. So the question is then, what do we do about this? So part of this, this idea of reimagining publics is the recognition that perhaps it is time to reaffirm that while it is true that there are some elements of shared identities among those who frequent a theater house, perhaps it is also time to recognize that when we create space for this difference, it also means creating space for those kinds of publics whose engagement with theater and in this public theater that is purportedly, again, for them. We can create pathways that work to affirm, let's say, a status of not being part of imagined national identity, of creating pathways for those voices and for those members of these publics who have ways of and modes of expression and modes of engagement in greater discourse that perhaps do not exactly use the same forms of language or the same tropes, let's say, that that have, let's say, that are, let's say, the backbone of the foundation of what it is that France's theater projects have been doing. So this suggestion then kind of brings me to right now, kind of something that I'm working on and I'm puzzling with. So this last part, it's going to be not, I don't want to say incoherent, but it's going to be some things I'm puzzling with perhaps, and maybe we can engage with it later. But if we have this idea of thinking about alternative modes of approaching the presence and fostering of the public theater, we have to start first from what kind of space a theater house should be. Again, is it a space just for this creating of this elite art? Is it a space for just creating an imagined national identity? Is it a space that reflects plurality and difference and interaction, etc.? Now, instead of perhaps situating it as a space whose existence and inner operations serve a specific goal, we can think of the theater as unstable. So it's not a place of a singular function. It is a space of structural fluidity that can, which is reflected both through who is running it, who is programming pieces in it, but also who's coming in and out of it and the different things you can use it for. We can redraw boundaries and connections between different groups with these renegotiations of space and spatial relationality. So, and the theater itself is conducive to that already. When you are in a theater and you are watching a piece, anything that you think of as stable can become unstable in a second. So for instance, if you are watching a play with one gesture, a space that has been, let's say, given a sense of architectural integrity kind of disappears. We can move from the interior of a house to an exterior in a second. This is especially true with with very minimalist types of pieces that France is a big fan of doing right now. But we accept this. We accept that there is constant room for renegotiation. We accept that nothing is, let's say, finite, that it is ephemeral, that these boundaries are always constantly being redrawn while we're in the theater. So why can't we do that when we're outside of it? When the theaters closed because of COVID-19, there was a lot of, obviously, economic concerns about what's going to happen to folks who work in the sector. And this is particularly true for what we call the intermittent de spectacle, so the intermittent workers. So on March 4th, 2021, a group of these workers, this includes actors, stage technicians, writers, and students, they went into the Odeon Theater in the 6th arrondissement and started an occupation that lasted up until very recently. I will add the occupation has not actually ended, they've just moved to another space. Now, The Odeon has its own history of occupations. It's been occupied famously in 1968, again in 1992, and also in 2016. But this is the one that's lasted the longest. And there's something interesting, I believe, that happened with this one that hadn't happened before. Rather than remaining inside entirely, what the groups did, they took advantage of, there's a large place, a large square in front of the theater. And they instead created a very porous space. So they were constantly in these interactions with the publics who came to support them. The second thing that happened along with that is that rather than just the group's aims staying centered on the particular concerns of their own sector, the intermittent, what happened was there was a convergence of movements, specifically with current debates over a reform on unemployment that is currently being discussed and being pushed through the French Parliament, essentially. Happened here is there was a sense, a reimagining of the theater space as itself part of an ecosystem. That we have, of course, disparate groups that might have their own concerns. That, the intermittent, for instance, we're not going to be directly affected by the retirement reforms if they maintain their intermittent worker status, of course. But there's a recognition that this space is not a space apart from. It is a space that is part of, in more ways than just serving this need of culture, this mission of forming of identity, of this mission of bringing, let's say, divertissement, etc., that it has been imagined as before. But it is directly and inherently tied to other sectors of society. And this movement, I would argue, has been partially successful as it has been because it has become in itself a web, let's say. We have theaters that are across France. At its height, it was about 100 theaters across metropolitan France that have been occupied. Many still are. Some are starting to end the occupation because theaters have been reopened since May 19th. There were some theaters in Italy. I think the National Theater in Athens got involved very briefly, from what I saw. But then ultimately, and this is kind of where we end right now, there is perhaps a new conflict that is taking place, and not necessarily from the government, but more from the directors of the theater. So when the theaters were going to reopen on May 19th, there were two artistic directors. One is Stéphane Braunschweig at the Odeon. The second was Wajdi Mouawad at La Colline, which is also in Paris, both of which were occupied, who released statements. And they pointed to a couple of things, and both of them addressed this idea of convergence, and I would argue put themselves at the opposing end of this web, of this being a part of thing. Notably, Braunschweig pointed to this act of convergence as a potential detriment, stating in an interview he gave with the magazine Télérama, he said that, and I'm translating, the problem with occupations is that their needs that they are fighting for go beyond the sector of live performance. Similarly, in a manifesto written for the website for La Colline, Mouawad himself also critiqued a certain practice during the public, let's say, gatherings and meetings that would happen every day during the occupation, where folks who wanted to speak, folks who wanted to engage and interact, they would state at one point what they would position themselves, say, oh, I'm an intermittent worker, I'm a student, I'm unemployed. Not in the sense to say that I'm a part, like I'm putting myself, distinguishing myself as away from everything else, but to say that, yes, I have this particularity of my identity. But it's that particularity and that difference that I'm bringing into this table. It's that difference in perspective I'm bringing into this, but the fight is still the same. So both now, and when in Mouawad's, let's say, visioning, what he ended up doing was pointing to this as playing into games, let's say a certain discourse that's held particularly by the far right in France right now that critiques all this ideas of identity politics, where they're to divide, which in itself is a misreading of what is going on, but essentially pointing it to, in his case, not a threat to French identity, but a threat to perhaps the larger mission of the theater, that it goes against it, that having this kind of convergence and having this kind of thing going beyond a certain sector, which is in itself divisive, placing theater apart from, as if it is not, it holds a space, it is a space in itself that is, let's say, elevated, that is someplace à l'écart, away from the greater level of society, that seems to be a rejection of, in both cases, this idea of an ecosystem and the idea of the S. So right now, where we stand, there is more I would like to explore with this, but there is a lot. I think it's going to start coming to a head as things start to reopen, as we start to see, I think, the fallout of what, of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what is going to happen with subsidies, with fundings, and how, let's say, in effect, that will, and as we see folks, the wealth gaps and the other gaps and the cultural gaps continue to widen, we are, I think, at a point where we could either go on one way and embrace difference and embrace this S and the possibilities, even if they are tenuous, of bringing that into the imagination of what the public theater could be, or on the other way, taking a more, let's say, conservative perspective on insisting on, at the end, on this notion of a singular national identity. So that is where I will conclude. Hopefully everyone was able to follow, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Effie. That was amazing. I want to give now the floor to Zafiris, who is going to give his own perspective on what's going on in Greece right now when it comes to minority theater. So Zafiris Nikitas is a postdoctoral researcher at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. He studied law and theater at the Aristotle University and completed graduate and postgraduate studies in both disciplines with magna cum laude. His research interests focus on the cultural poetics of modern Greek theater of the 19th and 20th centuries, and more specifically in aspects of modernism, minority theater, nationalism, gender studies, and folk theater. He has published articles in peer-reviewed Greek and international journals such as Skini, Critical Stages, and participated in multiple history, theater, and Greek studies symposia organized by universities such as the National University of Athens, the Freie University of Berlin, the University of Macedonia, the Ionian University, and the Aristotle University. As a researcher, he has collaborated with research centers such as the Foundation for Research and Technology, FORTH, at the also and the Bayerische Staatenbibliothek. He has taken part in 2 research projects, and he is a member of the Hellenic Association for American Studies, HELLAS, the International Federation for Theater Research, IFTR, and a reviewer in international journals such as International Journal of Arts, Theory, and History. Finally, he has received academic fellowships, most recently an excellence by the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation, HFRI, for his doctoral research after being ranked first with a grade of 97 out of 100 at his university in humanities. Congratulations, Zafiris, and welcome to this panel.
Well, thank you so much, Vassiliki. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you for taking the time to organize this event, which I think is very interesting. And I will move on to a kind of different decenters and recentering in a way the mentality of Greek theater, which is not so much institutional as, and in terms of identity as Effie explored, but it's more about creating thematics of social engagement in Greek theater, which is mostly about happening in the last decade. So the title of this presentation is exploring the Greek paradigms of minority theater. In a way, minority theater is a very large category that includes both dramaturgy and also performances. And it's a kind of genre that explores different social issues. And the aspect of minority theater that I will focus on is aspect of immigration, which is very important in Greek minority theater, and rising after the 2010 different crises that the kind of crisis scapes, as they have been called, that emerged in Greece in the Mediterranean era, and of course in larger contexts in Europe and globally. So what is very interesting in terms of minority theater in Greece is that younger Greek directors who also act as dramaturgs have proposed a series of performances that touch on themes of minority, statelessness, and in a way the otherness of the people that have moved around in the Mediterranean sphere in the last decade. So these directors are mostly, as I said, young directors like Anestis Azaz and Sofia Eugenopoulou, Rafika Sawis, and they have proposed a series of sociopolitical performances that explore immigration using diverse aesthetics. They use music theater, they use documentary theater, and they use devised theater. In a larger context, this is minority theater is a subgenre of political theater, and it is also quite interesting in my research the fact that in a way this is a kind of tendency that connects to the so-called theaters of engagement, which is in a way the new tendency that breaks away from the post-dramatic mentality. So instead of proposing fragmented and in a way cold and sometimes nihilistic performances that were very much part of the post-dramatic corpus that has been explored by Hans-Tys Lehmann, this kind of theater of engagement is a theater that focuses on personal experience and also very much on social themes, and through, of course, a kind of experimentation in terms of aesthetics. So there's both the themes and, on the other hand, the aesthetics. Verbatim theater, documentary theater, is a quite usual form of addressing these political issues. And these are political issues that in a way break away from a kind of neoliberal and also consensus-oriented, in a way of thinking, and they move towards what the Rancière has called a kind of a dissensus and a kind of breaking away and finding the different artistic and political opinions that can form a kind of a democratic and explosive result. So I would like to focus on two case studies. The one is the case Pharmakonisi, which was performed in 2015. And the other one is the performance Europeana by Rafika Sawis, which was performed in 2019. These are two very different aesthetically performances, and these are performances that focus on themes of mostly immigration and identity. So the first performance is a kind of a case study of theater of reality and is directed by Anestis Azas, and a quite acclaimed but also quite young still Greek director. And this is a kind of documentary theater performance that focuses on the social experience. And as the title reveals, Case Pharmakonis, or the Justice of the Water, this is a performance that recreates a kind of trial on stage, a kind of theatrical trial in order to re-examine the way a series of refugees were condemned by the Greek justice for arriving in Greece in 2014. So this is a very elaborate research on the subject, and a kind of representation and reclaiming of the idea of identity and justice in the context of the Greek, in a way, immigrant crisis. The research of the performance includes talking to lawyers, in a way also talking to the refugees that were imprisoned, and trying to find a way to pose different, in a way, viewpoints from the European Court of Human Rights in order to retrial and award justice for these immigrants. So the very interesting part of this performance is the last part, which focuses on the imprisonment of a young Syrian who was on board on sea and convicted of smuggling refugees. So through the enactment that we see in the performance, we listen to the information acquired by the lawyer of the Syrian who lives in Athens, and he claims that the liability of the members of the Coast Guard should have been investigated more thoroughly. Since the maritime attorney acquitted them of any liability, someone has to be blamed in a way for the incident. And the lawyer, who is portrayed by a performer that has studied law but has not practiced it, explains that the defendant has the burden to prove all prior procedures were erroneous. So here we see that there's a kind of a theater of reality using performers that are very much professionally connected to the role they represent on stage. This is quite very often also in the works of Milo Rao, for example, also a very quite acclaimed director on documentary theater and politically engaged theater. And in a way, this kind of performances push forward the political agenda. What is very important in terms of centers and reforming the centers of theater in Greece and institutions, this performance was presented in a different stage of the National Theatre, which was called -1, and it was called the experimental stage of Greek theatre. So from 2014, what's very important is that the institution of the National Theatre, in a way, pushed forward the ability of a political agenda through this experimental stage. I should also mention that very different performances of minority theatre in a larger sense have been presented in such a venue. For example, a very important performance was one about the trials of a very well-known organization in Greece spreading terror called the 17th of November. This political organization that has murdered various political targets. And this performance showcased the ideas of the people that were imprisoned and created a very vibrant political discussion, led to being stopped from being performed, because it was considered the kind of performance that cannot abide to the sentiment of the people in Athens. So this is a very vibrant topography of social theater, of political theater, of theater about immigrants, using aesthetics that are very diverse and creating discourses in the larger context of the Greek society. So what is interesting is both the creation of the minority theater and the elevation of this minority theater through well-known institutions, both from state and also non-state, that create platforms, new platforms for this political theater. And this creates also a kind of different sentiment about what theater and the future theaters can be in Greece, besides the more commercial theater genres. So I will move on to the second case study, which is called Europeana. And this is also a kind of performance that brings forward a more transnational viewpoint. It was created not only in Greece, but also in Europe, as it was awarded the Ibsen Award, a quite well-known award for theater and theater adaptation in a way. This is a kind of paradigm of adaptation dramaturgy, adapturgy, as the term has been used recently. And this is a performance that uses very different aesthetics. What is very interesting about these different aesthetics is the need to avoid a kind of didactic and clear message. So this experimentation with aesthetics, let alone the post-dramatic or the verbatim results that may happen, and in a kind of evolution about acting, directing, and also creating new dramaturgies, is also this need to abstain from a kind of ideological overpowering with the audience with ideological themes that cannot be open to interpretation. So this performance takes a very laid back, in a way, approach if we compare it to the other one, which is a very vocal, very political, very clear-cut, very realistically oriented documentary piece. This is a kind of post-dramatic opera, a kind of symbolistic, allegorical theater piece, which was presented in the Greek National Opera in 2019. So this performance adapts Little Eyolf, the very well-known play by Ibsen from 1894, which was about a disabled child neglected by its parents and losing his life in the sea. So this disabled child is now the symbol of the immigrant. But the performance does not make such clear-cut parallels. In a way, it blurs the kind of dramaturgical choices and creates a kind of chorus of lost children, a chorus of drowned children who sing along, who perform in this performance. And the background of the performance is, again, a kind of documentary theater background, a kind of research using multiple interviews from teenage refugees, and trying to portray the uncertainty of the dreams of young refugees. Of course, the result is a kind of, as I said, an allegorical result with music rather than words, and creating a kind of nightmarish result. Instead of in a way, engaging in a result of justice as the other performance did, this creates a haunting, harrowing result about, in a way, the burden on the conscience of Europeans who more or less will be drowned, will be destroyed by their own actions. So this is a kind of almost post-romantic sentiment that overflows in this performance. So another aspect that I would like to pinpoint in terms of creating different centers in terms of minority theater and in terms of institution, as it becomes clear, these are performances that are performed mostly, of course, in Athens, but they also connect with Europe. What is very vibrant in terms of a larger sense of minority theater is a minority theater of education. So the themes of immigration have been gradually integrated into pedagogical proposals in a way, and theater proposals and theater institutions that use theater as a kind of pedagogical tool. So there's a kind of cultural politic which connects minority theater with young students in Greece and using minority theater as a kind of in a way, a tool of illuminating social justice and the acceptance of otherness. So there is a series of performances for example, in Onassis Stegi Cultural Center, which is one of the biggest non-state institutions of theater in Greece. And also, there is a series of new dramaturgies. Some of them, for example, one of them is called Aegean Monologues, and the second one is called Quarantine Monologues. The second one is written by refugees themselves. So this is a series of monologues that is destined to be performed by young students in schools, and this is also part of an UNESCO policy in a way, and the collaboration of the Greek state. So what is interesting is creating this double mirror, this kind of engagement in terms of social issues in the social sphere, in the public sphere. And the other very interesting thing is trying to integrate theater as a kind of tool for pedagogy and the future of, in a way, human rights in Greece. So this is an overview of the topography of minority theaters in Greece, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zafiri. That was incredibly rich, and I'm so thrilled to be introduced to these 3 case studies of minority theater in Greece. I'm opening now the discussion, and let me start with this not question. It seems to me that we have these 2 opposing perspectives. So in France, we have this cultural politics of the desire to unify somehow the theatrical spaces, and now with the occupations that happen across the country, it seems that there's a desire to materialize what is happening currently naturally in a way in Greece due to the refugees, due to the minority theater that you described. Am I right in saying that or not?
So when I talk about this idea of a unified thing. It's not so much this idea that we're all the same, that everyone has to do the same thing, we have to talk about the same thing, and that, I mean, theaters in France have always been doing different things. It's just the way that theater is talked about and the way that the institution is imagined is in a way, yes, of course, everyone's doing different things, we're exploring different ideas, but as I'm talking about at a state level, at a government level, there is this idea that, you know, but they're still part of a greater project. And the French also, they're very, very tied to how much the state spends on culture and how much that is part of their program. I actually don't see too much of an opposition with what's going on stage, on different stages in France, to what you were mentioning, Zafiri, only because there is you know, on the one hand, on some stages in France, we have a political theater that fits exactly within a neoliberal model that only makes allusions towards asking questions and challenging things. You do have directors and artistic, not just, you know, theater directors and theater makers, but artistic directors who consciously have a vision of what the theater is in relation to its territory, that takes into account the possibility for dissensus and takes into account the political possibility of that. And I think the biggest difference is this, I'm not sure if this is a case in Greece, but in France, it's the territorialness of it, I think it's a very big element, I think, to the public theater project. It is a lot about imagining the territory, so that even if the theaters themselves are engaging on questions a bit differently, that there is this idea of like this network that they're also connected to the public project of like France and like the valeurs français. And that's kind of where we see, I mentioned the problem with bringing folks who think differently, and obviously this involves a lot of minority directors, a lot of minority actors, and I'm talking specific, you know, racial, ethnic minorities, folks who are openly, you know, LGBT, getting their voice and their way of speaking into the space. That's where the tension starts to come in, not because of the fact that it is different, but because it calls into question the colonialist, aspects of what is happening. So I think when you look at it if I had gone into some case studies, I think we might have seen some similarities of things being brought up. But I think where I see the big differences is this idea of the network of the territory, the territorial aspect of it, which regardless of what's happening on the stage, there is still that big superstructure that affects it, I guess.
Great. That's a wonderful response. And Zafiri, you said that those productions of the minority theater were supported by the state, the national theater, the experimental scene, and also the Onassis Stegi. What is the cultural agenda behind those, do you think? Is it because in the past the theater has been accused for being too national, or now they're trying to open up and being considered that they are accepting otherness? So I would like to hear your take on that.
Thank you so much, Vassiliki. You have pinpointed exactly the root of the good and the evil as well, because in a way, this is a kind of zeitgeist driven as well momentum in terms of minority theater in Greece, which can only be understood in a more socio-political context in what's going on in Greece. So in terms of this kind of crisiscapes that I mentioned before, and the pressure on Greece and Greek identity in terms of how we react to otherness and immigration, and also in a kind of tension that was created with Germany, for example, in terms of the austerity measures and the south-north narrative that the Greeks are in a way lazy, so they've gotten what they deserved in a way. So there's this kind of pressure in terms of exploring otherness, in terms of pushing forward a social agenda of discourse. And this plays a very, very important role in the institutions being energized. Also, the dramaturgy that I mentioned, written by the of course, by the refugees. This is funded by the state, but also by UNESCO. So there's also in terms of funding, there's a terms of creating a mirror of cultural diversity and dialectics of difference. So this is a very complex issue that has been pushed forward through urgencies, socio-political urgencies. But also there is a background of new different Greek directors who have connected with the Rimini Protocol. They have connected very much with a documentary theater. So the documentary theater aspect was imported around 10 or 12 years ago in a more mechanical, mimetic way. And now the themes, the social themes, were created by reality itself. So there's a background of aesthetic preparation in a way, and the European cosmopolitan exploration of new directors who go away from the two tendencies that were before, that the one is the national theater, and the other is the post-dramatic theater by major Greek directors from the 1980s and 90s, which is more either an aesthetically oriented theater, more intellectual theater, or a more anthropological theater. So not going into the social themes themselves. So I think there's a series of good and very specific preparations and backgrounds that explode and create this kind of institutional urgency in connection with these new theater directors.
And the theme of instability, you mentioned, Effie, it's good to have the theater open and stable, fluid. I love this idea and brings me back to the theater as play, and a very relevant topic of my research. So tell us more about that flexibility, the wish to see the space, the theatrical space, as more fluid.
I think first of all, what needs to happen on an institutional level, I think we need to relook at how we are putting people in charge of the theater. So I mentioned before that there was some leftover things from Vichy, that of course no one really mentions that they're from Vichy because we don't do that. But one of the things that was left over from Vichy, which is actually not that bad of a thing in and of itself, is that in order to be the head of what's called a national theater like the Odeon, or what's called the Centre Dramatique National, a national drama center, you have, and even in the Maison de la Culture, you have to be from the theater sector. With the first two, you are also required to create and put on your own work. Which means that the public theaters in France, they're very much engaged with creating new works. That is their prerogative. That is when you have a 3-year contract, which is the average contracts for artistic direction are 3 years, which you can renew, I think, up to once. I think they're once renewable. So it's a theater that is, in a sense, it does respond to its time because by nature it has to. The issue is, what kind of voices are we seeing on the stage and what kind of language are we using? And part of the other problem is that, so for heading a national theater or a national drama center, you're appointed by the Minister of Culture directly, which means you have to have gotten a certain level of access to that position. It is very rare for someone who is not from certain milieu to get to that point because of France's system of concours competitions and getting renown. And this is very much anchored not just in theater, but in almost every sector of society, which is why, to a certain degree, our politicians look and are from certain backgrounds. now what's happening right now is that there is a movement that was gaining momentum and that hopefully will still get it, about decolonizing the arts. Are there pipeline programs? Kind of. Kind of. I mean, we have like kind of, I think with Zafiris similar, we have, you know, things in schools trying to get folks. But the issue is, if you go out into the banlieue in Paris, for instance, folks do not go to the theater there because they don't think the theater is for them, which is kind of sadly true because of who is heading the theaters and who is bringing things in. So it's not that the theaters are not engaged with the current moment. It's just that it's a very limited perspective by nature, unless someone goes out of their way to try to bring in different things, which has happened. It's also caused a lot of issues. I'm thinking, for instance, of Philippe Ken, who was heading the theater at Nanterre, who he decided not to renew his contract in part because he, not so much in terms of minority identities, but in very different ways of artistic aesthetics and expression. He was going against, let's say, the expectations of the mayor of Nanterre, who wanted things to be a certain way because this is what the public is expecting. But there's these tensions kind of exist. So the problem is when you bring in someone who might say, you know, maybe it's time that we actually actively bring in folks who have a different perspective and who will destabilize, you know, really create an actual political theater, rather than something that has the air of the political. So I think even our documentary theater has to some degree here become kind of stale because of who is writing, where some of the stories come from, and the process through which they are adapted, and then in that case, you know, filtered. This is not, you know, always the case. There are things that there are exceptions, but this is, so yeah, there's a movement I mentioned that's called Décolonisons les arts. So let's decolonize the arts. And this speaks to not just with theater, but in the visual arts and other performing arts as well, really thinking about who is brought into these, or is it just, you know, someone starts at La Colline, then moves to the Odéon, and then moves to the Théâtre National de Strasbourg, and then moves to somewhere else. It's the network itself, even though it's, you know, good in the sense that you have folks who are from the theater world and who are creating pieces during their time, you know, as artistic directors, it's become in itself very small and insular and become, you know, kind of exclusive. So which perhaps speaks to the different responses in part from, you know, artistic direction teams, because I will say the intention of the occupations is never to fully impede shows going on again, because this is how some people make, you know, this is how people earn their livelihood, and they need to get those hours back to maintain their intermittent worker status. But this idea that there is, because of the way the network moves and because of the way that folks, you know, come up in that network and the opportunities that they have or don't have, it becomes in itself its own little elite on the directorial level. So if it wants to be porous, it has to first of all be more open to letting other people in through alternative measures and through actively working to seek out voices that perhaps are not going to use language that is prototypical of a certain conception of theater and culture, that questions, that calls into questions, that really questions the models in which we live now. And it does happen. There are plays that do that, but I argue it could happen more if we made an active effort into it. So yeah.
Effie, you have worked at the archives of the Opera, right? In France.
At the opera? No, so, at the Comédie Française.
Comédie Française. Yeah. Wait. So to what extent do you think this hierarchical, competition-oriented superstructure that exists, historically speaking, in the French theater inhibits that fluctuation or fluidity in the theater?
And do you think, in the sense that, is this a pattern we've seen before, or?
Yeah.
I think it's a pattern we've seen before. I mean, I think France is a country that goes through it goes through cycles, and nothing is really ever permanent. It just so happens that before it was under the Ancien Régime, and now it's under neoliberal capitalism. So, but I mean, so under the Ancien Régime, but the theater going experience was very different. For one thing, people did not sit down and stop talking. The theater as a social space was very different. The theater as the porosity of the inside outside was actually much more, I think, felt, in part because one thing that they used to do was, before the show would start, the troupe, the Comédie Française, would come out and do a little preview of what would be happening, or do another little sketch of what would be happening before, to try to get folks to come in. Much more elitist, obviously, at the time in terms of who was going, but the publics were different at the time as well. But I think the tension we're seeing now is, I think, there is, it does, I think, to maybe a degree, recall the political tensions that were going on at the Comédie Française around the time of the revolution, because the Comédie Française, the troupe, was also itself divided about what to do, because they were directly tied at that time with the monarchy. But there were members of La Troupe who did not agree with what was going on, so they ended up decamping and moving to actually the Salle Richelieu, where the Comédie Française is now, and the Odeon actually was where the royalists were playing. But I think I could see, the sense that there is, in a way, perhaps, now thinking about how a theater interacts with its publics, and kind of how it interacts with them beyond just, and what it could be as a voice among many voices in the greater public the public tapestry, I guess, or public discourse. I think the fact that that's coming, that there are directors who are bringing this into question, that there are Occupy movements that were directly calling this into question. I think we could see some reflection of what was happening in, the end of the 18th century, with what is a theater supposed to be in this time of tension and turmoil, and re-examining who it is, or what it is that we want to be as a society.
I saw, Hannah, you had a question.
Well, first of all, thank you both. This was amazing. So interesting. And I'm wondering, Effie, for when you were talking about how the vision before for creating like a national identity, I'm thinking about how in different like gender studies or feminist studies, a lot of times the idea of like national culture is like transmitted through women and like motherhood specifically, often. And I'm curious if that's like the question of or if there's any like overlap you've witnessed between the idea of national culture being like transmitted through women and or motherhood, and also like as like the process was also being created with like the national identity created through the theater space.
I would say probably not under Malraux. Under Vichy, yes. Because Vichy was very concerned with the transmitting on genes and preserving, in the sense of preserving a certain regionalism and regional cultures, which is, it is what it is. But no, and for Malraux, he was thinking more that culture is something that transcends history and time, and it's something that, but he said it's something that connects us all. He gives an example that if you put like Caesar and Ramses, I think he must have mentioned Napoleon, in a room together, they wouldn't be able to connect on things about their day-to-day life, but you get them talking about battles that they've engaged in, then they would, click, let's say. And the idea is that culture is something that surpasses all of this. It is that which brings us closer to what it means to be human. It has us engage with the notion of our humanity, the notion of our own temporality. However, the references that he makes for these interconnected stories are very much those of the Western canon. So talking about the Odyssey, talking about the Iliad, and then moving into, this, he doesn't explicitly create a linear history, but it's there, moving to the neoclassical theaters of like Racine, Corneille, Molière, etc., etc. But saying that we go to these, and the idea is that everyone should, these should be accessible to everyone, which borrows from, specifically from the Front Populaire, which was this, let's say a socialist, like left, like government, like group, political group in the 30s, which really, before the outbreak of World War II, especially, really, I think, got the furthest in getting a decentralization project off the ground before, you know, the conflicts, you know, erupted. But their whole thing was that everyone should be able to connect with Shakespeare. They should be able to do that because it's not, because they touch on things that everybody can relate to. It's just a matter of how you present it. The issue is that it was in its, even, you know, in itself, this like higher idea of we can connect through all these different things. The reference points themselves are limited. And that's where the problem is when you start to bring in things that there are other alternative ways of viewing time and of conceiving of histories and storytelling and of the way and of our, what it means to be in the world. And some of those might, you know, come in direct conflict, and that's where the tensions, I think, kind of go. But it's not in terms of passing on, you know, for, because in France it's not, it's the la patrie, the fatherland, the pater, the fatherland, whatever. But our symbol is La Marianne, who is the Marianne, the one who is the thing with the revolution. You see her everywhere. It's a bit weird, but not, you know, not so much, I think, not so much with Malraux. With Vichy, yes, that was part of the program, but not some, with him, it was more thinking a transcendence beyond materiality, let's say.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. That was amazing. And Zafiri, I had a question about the production you talked about for an example, or the case study that did the legal restaging or retelling, which was so cool. I was curious if in like a cultural context or Syrian context, if there's a epistemological difference legally as far as how the legal system works. And if so, was this staged under like a Greek legal context, or was it also like restaged as if it had a legal framework from the people who were in the actual situation?
Thank you, Hannah. This is very interesting. The performance case Pharmakonisi or the Justice of the Water is exactly for a case which happened on an island called Pharmakonisi. And in this incident, the Greek police arrested a Syrian refugee and the people he was transporting to Greece. So the trial looks into the Greek justice system and how it, in a way, decided upon this very specific case. So in a way, it's a radical performance because it does not override, of course, the authority of Greek justice, but it retrials the trial that has happened. And it, in a way, it talks to the lawyers, it talks to the prisoners, it brings forth the evidence. So this is a very radical approach to portraying that maybe the Greek system is not ready to, in a way, deal with these incidents. So, in a way, the idea behind this performance is a dialogue on the laws of the Greek system for the immigrants, rather than a kind of crusade for letting go the specific prisoner. So this is very interesting what happens in this, and it focuses, yes, on the Greek system and questions the readiness of the Greek justice system to abide to a kind of justice that is connected to now, to the specific changes connected to the immigrant crisis in this context, rather than using older law, which of course applies, but is not informed enough to lead to justice.
Thank you. It was so interesting and such a cool like staging projects that they did.
So two other possible models for accessing or re-accessing theatre, which seem to be your focus. Number one, the idea of travelling theatre troupes, whether you think that they are maybe constitutional more to certain countries than others. Are there travelling theatre troupes in France, which historically has not been fragmented, and how that might interact with other performance genres like circus, vaudeville, that kind of thing?
With traveling troupes, there's not too many. Actually, shows themselves travel around a lot here. So, you know, if something is produced in Rennes, for instance, I mean, eventually it'll make its way to Paris because everything finds its way here eventually. But the shows themselves tend to travel around a lot because this is one of the benefits of the network working as it does, and the benefits of it being like subsidized is because we can afford to do that. But that being said, for more performance arts like cirque troupes, I know that it's not as present, I would think, on this theater scene, but there are troupes, for instance, in the summer who go as like really out into the country and set up like outdoor kind of things then, but that's a very seasonal very seasonal practice. But otherwise, I think the fact that shows travel around as much as they do, and the fact that we have all these different kind of theater houses kind of all over the place kind of facilitates that a little bit. But with site-specific theater, it doesn't happen too much. And I think one of the reasons is because for the theater troupes do not have to rent out a space, for instance, theater space. So they're not exactly have the same financial concerns for accessing space as a troupe might have in the States, for instance, because of the way this is for publicly funded theaters. However, I do know of, there's one troupe that I've seen some of their stuff. It's really fun. They're the Montford Theater. And what they have done recently is this pre-COVID, they were doing adaptations of the Three Musketeers, but doing it in different locations around the city, like kind of going into maybe one of their apartments, but then the audience would be outside and they would be playing out the window, but they would also do it kind of like serializing it. So you would go in, you wouldn't see the whole thing. It'd be like, this week we're doing episode 4, which would correspond to a certain part of the novel. So there are sometimes like a Maison de la Culture might sponsor or put on a site-specific theatrical event because they have the financial, backing to do that. I think in the summer is when you can tend to find more alternative things, like at Avignon, at the theater festival at Avignon Off, for younger troupes. You see them kind of implanting themselves in alternative spaces. But during the actual season, not quite, but mostly because of, I think, in the public theater, mostly because of the kind of financial support that they have, that the concerns seem to be a little bit different. It doesn't mean that, I wouldn't say that it doesn't exist, that perhaps it should there should be more efforts in doing it, because the space of a theater, regardless of the project, of the artistic director, the space itself might carry with it a certain level of exclusivity. When the publics that are going to see the shows are not necessarily the same as the ones who live in the area, there's only so much of that public funding that can work, of the outreach that can work. And when, for instance, the person who's running the theater maybe has never lived, or doesn't even live in Saint-Denis, or doesn't live in Aubervilliers or Bobigny. So I think there's an argument, perhaps it could be made for that, perhaps using some of the funds to giving, without discrimination, to really local actors who speak of the territory that they are located in.
It's you raise a whole other genre of, we talk about politics and theatre, or the politics of theatre. Your focus on the economics of theatre. I remember
Yeah. The economics are a big part of it. So.
Zafiris, would you like to say a few things about how do you envision the role of theater as pedagogical today?
I think that, for example, in a national theater, the new director, which is Sofia Vienopoulou, also the National Theatre has reframed theatre for young audiences. So this goes back to what theatre for young audiences is in Greece. In the last 2 decades, it has transformed, and I think that there is a strong sense of cultural politics in terms of theatre for young audiences as well, even more so than for the theatre for everyone else. So there, one of the targets is an ideological dialogue on otherness, and Sofia Vienopoulou has made sure to incorporate performances such as The Journey, which was a couple of years ago, exactly as a kind of devised theater for young audiences, with the participation of young audiences and the participation of immigrants as well. So there are specific programs, pedagogical programs, which focus on otherness, and also they focus on bringing on school classes from all over Greece, and mostly from Athens, in order to take part in workshops with immigrants or watch a performance on immigrants. So this is a systemic pedagogical term which is also connected to the cultural politics of Greece in terms of otherness and the immigration crisis and all the context of human rights in the last 5 to 10 years. And on the other hand, the Onassis, for example, Cultural Center has also staged such performances for young audiences and also for audiences that can connect to the immigrant issue. So I think this is taken the turn of creating workshops mostly, and using the themes of immigration. And also there is a politics of incorporating immigrants one way or the other in these workshops, either by using their writing or using their performances. So there is a need not only to, in a way, relate in a theoretical manner, but in a more invested manner by calling the immigrants and creating spaces of connecting, real connecting, of meeting. So this is a kind of pedagogical term, which of course takes place mostly in Athens, but also creates a series of programs through the libraries, the National Library of Greece, which has departments in all Greece.
Thank you so much. I can't believe we are almost done with the time that was allocated to us. I'm so thrilled we had this amazing discussion, rethinking theater politics in France and Greece. You both brought up incredible questions and food for thought. And I can't wait to see your next projects, next articles. And Citizen Tales is here to support you. It's so fascinating that you are both inspired by Rancière's theories. And in fact, Citizen Tales Commons was built upon his theories, besides others. So I want to thank you. A big applause to both of you and to our audience with their wonderful questions. Thank you again for an incredible panel and discussion.